20 years after U.S. troops began the war in Afghanistan, the Taliban are once again in control of the country. The capital city of Kabul was captured yesterday. Tensions and fears are now escalating as the clock is ticking to evacuate Afghans and American citizens. For the latest on the White House response to this, I want to bring in Ed O'Keefe. Ed, all of these developments come as the U.S. prepares to mark 20 years since 9/11 in just a few weeks. While the president hasn't said much publicly on Afghanistan over the past week, what can you tell us about internal discussions at the White House and within the Biden administration?
Well, good morning, Laura. We know they continue with the president up at Camp David, and most of his security advisors here in Washington were calling in from Afghanistan and elsewhere. These are conversations that undoubtedly are reviewing the ongoing developments there in Afghanistan and probably also reviewing why it is that this took why it happened so quickly, going against the public pronouncements of the president and the Secretary of State, who had both suggested that what has transpired in the last 72 hours or so wouldn't happen. We are waiting to see whether we will hear or see the president publicly today. So far, there's nothing on his schedule. He was scheduled this week to be at his home in Wilmington, Delaware for a working vacation. So he's already scheduled to be somewhat off the grid, or at least keeping a lower profile. But how or whether he can do that, given what's unfolding in Afghanistan and for how long, remains to be seen. The last time he spoke about Afghanistan was last Tuesday, almost a week ago, when he was asked by a reporter whether he had any regrets about the ongoing drawdown in Afghanistan, and he made clear he does not. Since then, he's only issued a written statement on Saturday and otherwise avoided the cameras, which is rare for this president who, despite not being like his predecessor, has been trying to do at least one thing a day publicly where he speaks out or maybe even takes questions from reporters. So not seeing him is different, but again, it's partly because he was scheduled to be at a lower level of activity anyway. But this kind of situation clearly is going to probably be unsustainable for him to not be seen or heard from a little more in the coming days. We'll see.
Yesterday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken pointed to a May 1st deadline to remove forces.
Yep.
Remind us, Ed, how this involves the previous administration and why this May 1st deadline is significant to what we're seeing unfold right now in Afghanistan.
It had been set by the Trump administration in negotiation with the Taliban and the Afghan government that U.S. forces would have been out by May 1st. When the Biden administration took over, pretty quickly they made clear they weren't going to be able to meet that May 1 deadline, and so they extended it and told the Taliban and the Afghan government we'd be out by September 11th, 2021, 20 years since the 9/11 attack. All parties seemed to be okay with that except the Taliban, which had said, "Did you not hear us? May 1 was the agreement." And they began their summer offensive, as they have for the last 19-20 summers, and made their moves into all of those provincial capitals, and again over the weekend into Kabul. So he said in a statement over the weekend that he had inherited this agreement, which he didn't necessarily agree with, even though he agreed in principle with the idea that the military engagement in Afghanistan had to end. And he's made clear since he made his final decision and his announcement that while he was going to be the fourth president to deal with the situation in Afghanistan after George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump, he will not hand this off to a fifth president. That appears to be sticking to that plan, but now there'll be questions about all the things he had said in addition to that, the idea that the Taliban couldn't do this, the idea that the country wouldn't revert back to them, and now it has so quickly. There'll be questions asked about that, and we'll see what kind of an influence that has not only on his domestic standing, but on America's standing around the world.
And also yesterday, Ed, top military leadership briefed House members on the latest in Afghanistan. What can you tell us about that briefing, and if Congress is potentially planning action or congressional investigations?
Right. There were briefings yesterday morning for members of the House and the Senate, bipartisan and by telephone, that were led by the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who told lawmakers that based on the Taliban's quick retaking of Afghanistan, the current U.S. government estimate that it would take at least 2 years for al-Qaeda to reconstitute itself in the country is going to have to be reassessed, that it could happen sooner. Remember, the original intent of U.S. military action in Afghanistan was to go in and root out al-Qaeda, which was based or harboring the country as its base of operations, led, of course, to the death of Osama bin Laden in neighboring Pakistan. There have been those that have argued for the last 20 years that was the original mission. When that was done, the U.S. should have left. And when Osama bin Laden was found and killed in 2011, that should have been the end of it. But of course, it continued for 10 more years. And so that is likely to be the line of argument you'll continue to hear from the Biden administration, that the original intent of this military mission was completed. It was time to get out. We're getting out. Majority of U.S. citizens agree, Americans agree with the theory that it's time to end military operations there, even if it results in a messy, chaotic, and potentially deadly weekend for not only Americans pulling out, but of course Afghans who are left behind.
Ed, I also want to ask you about the other big story in Washington today, the infrastructure bill and the reconciliation package. There's been disagreement among House Democrats as to how to proceed with the two measures. Where do things stand right now?
Yeah, and forgive the construction noise. That's actually what's supposed to be happening here right now.
Here we go. It's infrastructure.
With the president.
It fits.
Exactly. Well-timed infrastructure move there by the White House. Well done. That, of course, is the big domestic focus of this White House, which believes that by continuing to push for passage of the bipartisan plan and then the Democratic budget plan that has a lot of other sort of social infrastructure projects in it, that they will continue to win support for doing so. At this point, there are a handful of moderate House Democrats, and these are a handful of members who, frankly, are going to face tough re-election fights next year, who are telling Nancy Pelosi it's time to hold a vote on that popular, overwhelmingly bipartisan infrastructure plan, get it passed in the House and sent to the president for his signature, so that we have something to talk about over the next few weeks while we continue to be on a summer recess, although they're coming back next week to Washington to move forward with that Democratic budget plan, to set the table for it, because there are some procedural moves that have to happen to essentially codify the instructions to the various House and Senate committees that allow them to start writing this legislation, to ensure that by the fall they're able to pass things like having Medicare renegotiate drug prices, expanding universal pre-kindergarten programs, dealing or putting money up to deal with climate change concerns across this country and around the world. All of that has to be codified first, though, in the reconciliation package, as it's called, here in Washington. So Pelosi now has told her caucus, let's see if next week we can pass that and maybe also set the parameters of at least the debate on that bipartisan plan. That wouldn't be passage, which is what those moderates are looking for, but it would at least allow them to do some talking about it and some forward momentum. Remember, the reason that they want to do this, again, is it's popular. They want to get it done. And Pelosi has to be very sensitive to the fact that with a very slim majority, only about 6 seats, any wavering of a handful of her colleagues, either on the far left or in the middle, could spoil the chances of getting this thing passed.
Absolutely. And with the backdrop of everything that's going on in Afghanistan and the destabilization there, getting infrastructure passed would be a big win for the Biden administration.
It would be.
Ed, thank you.